Some of you guys are just getting to know Leonard and Andy and over the last couple of months, right? Since they've been around more frequently. But I've gotten to get to know them for the last, how long have you been here? 3 years? 3 years? It feels like longer that I've known you, right? No, but I've gotten to get to know them, and I truly, truly feel privileged to be doing this with you guys in this season. For those of you that don't know them well yet, they truly are as genuine gets. What you see up here is the real deal. It is the real deal. And I love you guys, and just really grateful to be doing this with you. Leonard mentioned it. I was on staff for quite a while. I've been around here for a long time, around this church for a while, worked in the youth department for a while, and I left staff about 2 years ago or so to spend some more time with my kids. I work part-time for a friend of mine. I've been married to my husband for about 14 years. We've got 2 boys, and I talk about them a lot. So fair warning, you'll probably hear about them when I teach. So just so you know. Anybody ready for Christmas? I can't believe it's Christmas yet. Anybody need a couple more weeks? That's me, yes. I do love Christmas, though. I do have a question, though. Has anybody ever gotten an unexpected Christmas gift? Maybe, yes. Some of you are like, yes, I got a really, really great unexpected Christmas gift. And some of you are like, yep, it was unexpected, and it was rather would not have expected it, right? Anybody have some of those? I couldn't remember getting a unexpected gift, but I did give an unexpected gift one time. My mom had a dog for years, and then the dog passed away, and so I decided, Mom, it's time, you gotta get a dog. And so I spent all this time finding the right dogs, found this local person who had it was a small breed. It was already 4 months old, so it was already potty trained. It was perfect. It was like, this is gonna be the perfect thing. I told my whole family, because my whole extended family was gonna be there. But obviously my mom didn't know, and so we show up on Christmas Eve, and you gotta do the whole thing when you get give a pet for a present, right? You gotta put them in the box, and Mom, open the box. Well, when they say don't get a pet for a gift, they're right. I'll just leave it at that. But I would just suggest maybe check with the person before you get the pet. That's all. I'm just going to leave it at that. But there are some things that are unexpected, right? We're in this series called Expect the Unexpected, and we're looking at the genealogy of Jesus and some of the unexpected events and unexpected people that we see in his lineage and finding out what it tells us about him, right? So last week, Leonard unpacked this genealogy that Matthew wrote, and Matthew wrote it with very careful detail to make it very clear to his readers, to the Jewish people, that Jesus is the Messiah that they've been waiting for. Jesus is the one who came all the way through the lineage of David. But there are some very unusual things about this genealogy that Matthew wrote, and specifically, that is because there are 5 women listed in this genealogy. And that's not typical for genealogies that we would see. It's a patriarchal society, and so typically genealogies were just lists of the men, of the fathers in the family. And so the other thing that's interesting about this is that all these women, most of the women that are listed here, are not necessarily women that we would expect to find in the lineage of the Messiah. Last week, Leonard was telling us about Rahab, who had maybe a dark past, right? She was a prostitute, but she had such deep faith in God that it propelled her to action to save and rescue the Jewish spies that had come into Jericho, and she ended up being a direct descendant of Jesus. And so this week, we're looking at another one of these women in the Jesus lineage. We're looking at the story of Ruth. Now, if you brought your Bible and you want to flip to that, it's kind of hard to find. It's really short. It's a teeny tiny little book right between Judges and 1 Samuel. You almost miss it if you flip too fast, right? So take a minute, find that. We'll put it up on the screen here too. But before we actually start with Ruth, if you have your Bible, just flip back a page to the last page of Judges. And I want to read this first because this kind of sets the stage for what's happening here. In those days, there was no king of Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So things were not good in Israel at this time, right? Israel had come into the promised land and they thought everything was going to be wonderful and great. But unfortunately, pretty quickly after they got there, Israel started to do things their own way. They wanted to not necessarily listen to the laws of God, and they wanted to do what they wanted to do. Well, things got bad pretty quickly. And so here's what we start our story. There's this one specific family, and they live in the town of Bethlehem. Sound familiar? There's a man named Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons. And while they're living there in Bethlehem, a massive famine hits the land, and there's not enough food. And to the point where Elimelech was like, I don't know if I can feed my family. We have to leave Israel. We can't stay here anymore. I don't know if we're going to survive. So they pack up, and they go to the country, the nearby country of Moab. Well, not too long after they're there, Elimelech dies. What a way to start the story, huh? Well, so his 2 sons eventually get married to some Moabite women there, but then very shortly after that, both of the sons die. And so here's Naomi, all by herself in this strange country with her 2 daughters-in-law. It's not good. Obviously, it's heartbreaking, right? I can't imagine losing all the people that I care about. But what's also interesting about this is that it puts the women, these 3 women, in an extremely vulnerable and desperate situation. Because a woman at that time, if she didn't have a husband, if she didn't have children, she also did not have property, she didn't have income, she didn't have any protection. So to be a childless widow meant bad for these women. It was not going to be good. And so Naomi decided, well, if it's going to be bad, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to Israel because at least I'll be with my own people. So she says to her daughters, I'm going to go back, but she loved them deeply. And she knew that if her daughters-in-law came back to Israel with her, that they were going to have a terrible life because, again, to be a foreigner and a widow in a strange country was not going to be good. It was going to be very difficult. So let's pick up here in Ruth 1, verse 14. It says, and again, they wept together. These women loved each other deeply. And Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. Look, Naomi said to her, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same. But Ruth replied, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. The loyalty of Ruth is pretty powerful, isn't it? She's essentially saying to Naomi, I don't care what happens to me. I don't know how we're going to make it, but I cannot leave you. I cannot go. I don't know what this future is going to hold, but if we're together, then it's going to be okay. And so here in the middle of all of this pain and all of this downward spiral of Israel, here's this bright spot in the middle of it, right? This bright, beautiful family that has such deep, deep love for each other in spite of background, in spite of race, in spite of culture, in spite of differences. And I think there's just, in this little moment, there's this beautiful picture of what the family of God is all about, right? Because we're here, all of us with different backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities, different cultures, all the differences, right? And yet we somehow ended up here together, and guess what? We are family because of the Lord. You know, I grew up, I was an only child when I was a kid. I'm still an only child. Whatever. So I was an only child, and there are a lot of times, you know, when you grow up an only child, there's a lot of times you just feel kind of lonely. And that was something that just kind of carried with me through a lot of my life, my young life especially. But it has been so powerful. One of the ways that God has worked so deeply in my life is to bring people into my life that I cannot imagine doing life without them now. It just started as a small group, just getting some people together, just like you're sitting next to some people here, and I cannot imagine doing life without them. And there are people that doesn't even have to go to this church. Like there are people that are my family that will never come in the doors of here because of the God who has saved us all. And that is the kind of family that we get to be a part of. I love what it says, how it describes us in Psalm 68:6. There's a phrase that said, he places the lonely in families. He does that. I hope and pray that all of us are able to find that same family. But ultimately, I think this picture of Ruth is saying, I'm not going to leave you. I don't care how bad it gets. I think that's a picture of the family of God that we get to be a part of, right? So another thing that's really interesting about this is that God had told Israel that they were not to marry any foreigners. They were to be set apart. They were supposed to be holy. And this wasn't because Israel was better than any of the other nations necessarily, or that God loved them better. It was because God wanted Israel to represent him to the rest of the people. He wanted Israel to be set apart so that the rest of the people could see the one true God. And so God wisely knew that if Israelites started to marry people of other nations, what was going to happen? God knew people are people. And so he knew that if they were to marry other people of other nations, that they would begin to worship other gods and that they would leave behind the life and the ways that God had laid out for them. Now Ruth, right, she's not Jewish. She's a Moabite. But notice what Ruth says here. She said, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. She's not only showing loyalty to Naomi, she's saying, I recognize that the God of Israel, the God that you serve, is the one true God. And I'm willing to leave behind everything I know, everything my life, my past, all the things, my potential security, possibility of finding another husband. I want to leave all that behind because I believe that there's something to what you have. And so Ruth and Naomi, they returned to Bethlehem. Verse 19, it says this, so the two of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. Is it really Naomi? The women asked. Don't call me Naomi, she responded. Naomi means sweet or pleasant. Instead, call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me? Can you hear the pain in her voice? Like, it's not hard to put yourself in her shoes. I cannot imagine what I would do if something happened and I lost my husband and my boys. I don't know what I would do. And so she knows that life is going to be really difficult ahead. But you hear what she's saying? She's saying, God caused me to suffer. God is the one who sent all this tragedy into my life. She's beginning to question the God that she has known her entire life. Are you really good? How would this ever happen if you were a good God? Have you been there? There's a Catholic poet, or was a Catholic poet named St. John of the Cross, and he calls this the dark night of the soul. This dark heaviness, when your grief and your pain feel like they're going to swallow you up. When it's hard to get out of bed in the morning because you know that there's just so much sadness weighing on you, right? And you find yourself questioning God, his character, and maybe even blaming him for your pain. And I think that's where we find Naomi. And I gotta tell you, I am so incredibly grateful that this little story, this little part of their story is here, because it gives me permission to be honest with God about the things that I feel and the questions that I have and the moments where things are dark and heavy and I can say, God, I don't get it. I don't understand. But God, are you good? Will you come through for me here? It allows us to be honest and say, if there is a woman in the Bible who can say this blatantly and say, I don't know if God is good, then it gives room for God to show how good he is, right? But in the midst of that dark night of the soul, it's a sad and lonely place to be, and it feels like it's never going to end. Well, the story continues in chapter 2, and Ruth and Naomi, they're living in Bethlehem, and they have nothing, not even food. And there is a law in ancient Israel. It's found in Leviticus 19, and it's the law of gleaning. If you don't know what gleaning is, essentially what would happen, what God commanded Israel to do is that any landowner or any farmer, when they were going out to harvest their grain or harvest their crop, what they were not supposed to do was harvest everything. If there were things that fell off or they dropped or things like that, they were supposed to leave it there. They weren't allowed to take all of it. And the reason for that was that there were women and poor and foreigners who were allowed to come and glean what had fallen off. And so here comes Ruth. She says, we don't have any food, so I'm going to go glean because that's the only way I can get some food. So she finds herself in this field. And as we pick up in verse 5. Then Boaz, who was the owner of this field that she finds herself in, he asks his foreman, who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? And the foreman replied, she is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter. All right, now let's be clear. Boaz is not just making small talk with his coworker about this woman, right? Yeah. Right? He's checking her out and he's wondering about her, right? And here's the thing that I find so funny. You would think that in all of these years we would have learned something new, but what is he really doing? He's going, hey, who's that? Who is that? What do you know about her? Is she single? Right? I mean, really, that's what we still do, right? So we haven't come that far in all these years. That's another story. So Boaz decides to do what any probably Jewish man would do to try to impress a woman, and he goes out of his way to be really generous with her. He goes to her and he tells her, hey, Ruth, don't go to any other fields. Just stay here. Just keep coming back here. My men will take care of you. They'll be kind to you. You can go ahead and drink the water that they draw from the well. He brought her over and made sure that she had lunch and plenty of food to eat. And then that afternoon, he went to all of his men and he said, hey, make sure you break off extra grain for her. Yeah. I know, right? He's just so generous and so kind to her. This isn't normal behavior, right? So Ruth, she spends all day gathering all this food, and she fills up this huge basket, and she goes home to Naomi, and then here's what happens. Verse 19, "Where did you gather all this grain today?" Naomi asked. "Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you." So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she'd worked. And she said, "The man I worked with today is named Boaz." "May the Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He is showing his kindness to us as well as your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers." Now, what's a family redeemer? Sometimes it's also referred to as a kinsman redeemer. Well, this is another part of Jewish law. There were a lot of laws, by the way, that God created to benefit those who were poor and weak. And the law of gleaning was one of them, and this is another one. Every 50 years was called the year of Jubilee. This is amazing. Any property that had been sold or mortgaged because of financial hardship, for example, every 50 years, any of that property was returned to its original owner. And that was to make sure that that property would stay within that family. God's design was always focused on people being worried about the good of each other rather than their own profit. And so that would happen every 50 years. But if someone had a kinsman redeemer, they didn't have to wait until the year of Jubilee. What a kinsman redeemer was, it was a close relative. It was someone who potentially was wealthy because they would be willing to pay a high price to purchase back the property that had been sold on behalf of this family. And then if they were willing to do that, then that property would be returned to that family. Additionally, there were also laws that outlined that if someone died without having children, if someone was widowed, his brother was required to marry the wife in order to preserve that family name and make sure that there was a lineage there. If there wasn't a brother, that would be the kinsman redeemer's responsibility. Now, all of this might seem a little strange to us, right? I don't know the last time that we heard about people responsible for marrying other people and all this, but the beautiful thing about this is that this is how God designed their society to take care of one another and to look out for the women and for the children and for the poor and anybody that just didn't have enough, right? It's beautiful. So God's kingdom is different because there were no other cultures, no other countries that were doing anything like this. And so for Ruth and Naomi to find out that Boaz was one of their redeemers, all of a sudden like that, it meant their life could be different. Yeah. Amen. So over the next couple of months, Ruth continues to glean in Boaz's fields. And then finally, after they see, yes, Boaz is very generous, Naomi finally tells Ruth, "Hey girl, it's time to make a move." Okay, maybe she didn't say it that way, but it's in there. You should read it. This kind of stuff is in the Bible. Okay, so Boaz, one night she goes to where Boaz is sleeping on the threshing floor. And this is where we pick up again in Ruth 3, verse 8. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she replied. "Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer." She's basically saying, "Will you marry me? Make me your wife." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," Boaz exclaimed. "You are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. Now don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do whatever is necessary, for everyone in town knows that you are a virtuous woman." So you fast forward just a little bit, and ultimately we find out that yes, Boaz and Ruth do get married, and they end up having a beautiful little baby boy. And just like that, Ruth's life has changed because of the generosity and the love of Boaz. You know, just like Leonard talked about with Rahab last week, what is beautiful about this is that God identifies somebody and he redeems them completely. Last week it was Rahab and he turned her life around, right? And he completely does the same thing with Ruth, totally changing her life. Her property is restored, her family is restored, but also her dignity is restored, right? And her worth. That is the God that we serve. Amen. This idea of a kinsman redeemer, I mean, this is thousands of years old, right? This is something that God laid out for the nation of Israel. And like I said, really the goal was so that people would treat each other well. But the whole time, this idea of a kinsman redeemer has been pointing to Jesus. Been pointing to the Messiah because Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. I mean, come on. A kinsman redeemer had to be willing to pay a big price. And that is what Jesus did. He paid the ultimate price, right? Because he said, there is worth there. I want to redeem what I see in my people. Something has been stolen from them. Something has been taken from them, and I want to redeem it. And that is the God that we serve. Jesus comes so that he can redeem us wholly and completely, now and forever. And did you notice how Boaz treated Ruth? It wasn't duty or obligation. It wasn't begrudgingly, right? It was kind and loving. And that is the God that we serve. That is the God that we serve. That's a picture of him. And I am so grateful for how God has redeemed me. Last week Leonard challenged us to spend a few minutes this last week and think of the areas and the ways in which God has redeemed us. If you haven't done that yet, you should totally do it. I sat this week and I was just thinking, man, I can think of so many situations and times. I was a dumb, naive high school student who was prideful and lonely and insecure and all these things, and that God came into my life and rescued me and redeemed me, and now I can look at my life and say, I am not lonely anymore. And that is because of God. That has nothing to do with the relationships that I made by myself, but it was because of him and the gift that he has given me. I know this is a story about Ruth, but can we talk about Naomi for just a second? I want to read you a couple more verses. Verse 14 says, when the women of town said to Naomi, praise the Lord, who has now provided a redeemer for your family. May this child be famous in Israel. May he restore your youth and care for you in your old age, for he is the son of your daughter-in-law who loves you and has been better to you than 7 sons. So Naomi took the baby and she cared for him as if he were her own. The neighbor women said, now at last Naomi has a son again, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David. Amen. She is redeemed in every possible way. She has a son again. But did you notice what the women called her? They did not call her Mara. They called her Naomi because her joy had been restored. God is a God who wants to not only reach into our lives and transform and redeem our lives, but he wants to transform our hearts. And that's where he starts. That's where he starts. He brought Naomi out of the dark night of her soul, and she experienced the light and the love of God. And so perhaps in this Christmas season, maybe you find yourself a little bit like Naomi in the dark night of the soul. I know that Christmas time is joyous and wonderful, and it's family time and all the things that are great. But I think for some people, in certain seasons, Christmas can be really, really difficult. And so if that's you today, I just want you to know that you're seen and that we're here with you. If you are carrying something heavy this season, if you're feeling like you're heavy with pain or grief or pressure, heavy with depression or worry, heavy with expectations. Maybe you feel like Naomi and you look back and you think, I used to be so full of joy and just don't recognize myself anymore. Here's what I want you to know this morning. I want you to look at the story of Naomi and Ruth and know that there is a God who wants to bring hope and joy back to your life and to your soul. He is not done with you. Naomi and Ruth thought their life was done and just normal and this is it. But God said, no, the story is not over yet. This is a season and I will redeem you. I will bring back your joy. I will bring back your hope and your peace and the things that you have lost. That is the kind of God that he is. And so for those of you who find that your heart is heavy and bitter this season, know that your joy is coming. Jesus came to restore your joy. And for all of the rest of us, maybe aren't in that season right now. I just was thinking this too. I mentioned the year of Jubilee and how that would happen every 50 years. God's smart, and he knows what he's doing, and he's providing this picture of something that we're going to experience later, because the year of Jubilee will come again. And Jesus is going to return. Advent, we're celebrating the birth of Christ the first time he came, but he is coming again. Our Redeemer is coming back to redeem his creation, all of the whole world and all of our lives, and there will be no more pain and no more fear and no more sickness and no more sadness. All of that stuff will be gone because it will be fully redeemed under his authority. That is the Lord that we serve. He is our Redeemer King. That's what it means to be redeemed. There's one more thing about the story of Ruth that I wanted to point out too. If you read through the whole thing, you will notice that God is rarely mentioned. Naomi and Ruth and Boaz will mention him from time to time, but You don't see him intervening in any way. God doesn't speak in this book. There's no miracles or dreams or visions, or there's not even a prayer. But it's very obvious that God has his hands all over it, right? Yeah. I mean, like Ruth didn't just somehow show up to this field, right, that happened to belong to Boaz, who happened to be their redeemer, right? That's not just coincidence. That is clearly ordained by the God of the universe. And I think the thing that is so amazing is we get in our heads, right? We get into our lives and we're just like, I'm just an ordinary person in an ordinary life and I don't make any difference. But God is saying, you know what? There's someone like Ruth who is just living her ordinary life, trying to survive, and now she is part of the lineage of the Messiah. And God has invited all of us in our ordinary, normal, everyday, uneventful lives to be part of the most epic story that he has ever written. That is what he has invited us into. To share with the world who he is. You know, I think about it for me personally. I spend most of my days typing on a computer, sending emails. Trying to make sure that the boys are like fed and go to bed on time and make sure that the lost Legos that Harvey lost on the carpet get found, right? My life is completely ordinary. And yet the God of the universe has invited me to be a part of his story. He has invited you in your ordinary lives to make a significant impact for him and for his kingdom. That is not something to be taken lightly. And not only that, but he is with us in our everyday, every single moments. There's not a moment that we experience that he doesn't see and that he's not a part of. And that he's not weaving his story and his thread into our lives. There's a pastor in Bridge Church in Tennessee. His name is Ian Simpkins. He posted this the other day, and I just wanted to share it with you because it was just a perfect reminder to me about how God is involved in our everyday moments. It says this, Emmanuel, God with us. That means God is with us in the ER, in the divorce lawyer's office, during finals, changing diapers. That's me. God is with us in prison, on the first date, during the ugly cry, in the drop-off line. God is with us in the graveyard shift, working the 12 steps, at the office, at the gym. God is with us in therapy, at the checkout, in the delivery room, doing dishes. God is with us on the bus, at the custody hearing, at the table, in AA. God is with us in the waiting room, during chemo, in recovery, at the funeral. God is with us at the altar, when we thought we'd be married by now, when till death do us part turns into there's someone else, when we're missing the one who's not here. God is with us when the pregnancy test is positive, when it's negative, when it's everything we hoped for, and when it's nothing we anticipated. God is with us today, tomorrow, on December 25th, and on every other day. He is not just looking after us. He isn't merely mindful of us. He's come to dwell with us. The word did not become a theory to be debated, a concept to be pondered, or a philosophy to be discussed. The word became a person to be followed, worshiped, and loved. The Most High became the most low. That is our hope. That is our peace. That is our God. You know, like I said, the story of Ruth is a short one. You'd literally miss it if you flipped too fast. But God saw her and redeemed her and said, you are significant and you will be a part of this story.